Okay, should I get started?
Yeah,
Okay.
Go
definitely.
for it. Yeah.
So, my name's Nil-Jana. I'm a postdoc at AWS right now. I used to be a grad student at CMU, which is when I did this work. And this work was based on an internship I did at LinkedIn, um, which I already said a couple of minutes ago, but just to repeat. So I'm presenting today on a paper with the title Long-Term Dynamics of Fairness Intervention and Connection Recommender Systems. This was published at AIS last year and done in collaboration with Cyrus Tichichu, Pritam Nandi, and Kinshal Kasu from LinkedIn. And okay, let's get started with this. I think we're all kind of aware. Okay, sorry, I need to move things around. Okay, we're all kind of aware what connection recommender systems are, right? Like connection recommendation is this idea of recommending people we may know. So every like social media platform has something like this, where they have a tab where you can click on and they recommend people you might be interested in connecting to or sending a friend request to. And in some cases, this can account for up to 50% or even more than 50% of the social network graph. So these systems are quite important. This kind of makes it imperative that we want to treat users fairly, right? Because actually being connected to the right people leads to important advantages. And that could be just increased visibility or something like that. But in the case of something like LinkedIn, it could be even more direct advantages where a recruiter could see you or you could see a job posting or something like that. And it could directly lead to job opportunities. So what do we do to make sure users are treated fairly? What people usually do is they try to enforce fairness metrics in every recommendation list, in every recommendation slate. But what we really want is some kind of equity in a second order variable. That could be something like network sizes, right? Like, let's say if men and women had similar network sizes and nobody was disadvantaged, then they might have the same utility that they could draw from the recommender system. This is something that we have in the back of our minds, but what we usually can intervene on is each recommendation slate, right? So the question is whether this approach works in the long run, where we intervene on the level of recommendation slates, but we hope to promote an equity in something like network sizes. This is exactly what we study in this work, and we do this based on a simulated recommendation cycle. Simulation here is a good choice for several reasons. First of all, obviously, it's kind of difficult to have access to data and like in deployment algorithm that you can actually publish on. But then also, doing these things through online experimentation can be very time consuming and cause real harm. So we might not want to do that. And simulation also gives us a nice closed off setting, right, where we don't have problems of network interference or anything like that. So what our simulation is doing, it goes through the cycle where in the first step, users look for recommendations. This could be like in a real deployed system, this could be you loading the tab of like possible friends or people you may know. And then we compute matching scores to other users. And then in the next step, this leads us to the optimization step where we assume a probabilistic ranking framework. So we solve for a probabilistic ranking matrix with additional fairness constraints. Based on that, recommendations are served to the users and users can form connections based on those recommendations, and we go to the next time step. We kind of loop through this cycle. This is like the high level process we're doing here. So how does that look like in more detail? Let's look at the probabilistic ranking framework here. So I'm denoting here the source member being the user that queries the recommendation. I'm using the word user and member interchangeably here. And D is the destination member that is potentially recommended. Then Q is the query, and the query here we say is a request for an ordered list of M destination members. So it's kind of some kind of finite list. Usually M is something like maybe 20 or something like that. In our simulation, right? In reality, it's like continuous scrolling, and we would like update the query. And then there's kind of like the salient matching score that we will talk about more in a little bit, but I'm denoting it here as U. That depends on both of the members and the query. And then what we're solving for is the probability ranking matrix P. So this matrix shows in row D and column R, it shows the probability of showing member D in slot R of the recommendation. Oh, I think there's someone in the waiting room. Also, like, I'm not sure, I should have said this earlier, but I'm not sure that I can cheat this chat if there are any questions. Maybe just interrupt me if there are any questions. Okay, so P in slot in row D and column R, we see the probability of showing member D in slot R of the recommendation. Okay, just to repeat that. And then we have this nu of R, which is kind of just the exposure of slot R, right? So everybody who has worked in recommendation like this knows there's some kind of position bias, and it's unrealistic to assume that users look at every slot of the recommendation with the same intention, right? So this is just kind of discounting later slots in the recommendation list, because users usually put most of their attention on like the first or second, third recommended people. And then if you're like 10th in the list or something, it's much less likely that you're actually looked at. Okay, this is the system. The optimization that problem then becomes to maximize the expected source side utility subject to some probability constraints. These probability constraints are very light. They just say things like every user can be shown at most in one slot in the recommendation, and every slot has to be filled, that kind of thing. Not too interesting. But to all of the system, we now want to add fairness constraints. And in this paper, we look at two types of fairness constraints. The first one is demographic parity of exposure. Here we require that groups are displayed in recommendations at equal rates. So for two groups, that means that the exposure they get, kind of summed over all of the slots, discounted by the position bias, should be proportional to the group size. And then the second type of constraint we're looking at, we call dynamic parity of utility. And here we say that groups receive the same rates of utility. And we kind of use the word utility to describe these matching scores here. Like, assuming matching scores measure some form of utility, we now require that these utilities discounted again for the position bias are proportional to the group sizes. And the reason why this is called dynamic is because this utility usually heavily depends on the state of the system and the time step and all of that. Whereas the demographic parity of exposure constraint is kind of like the same in every time step. Okay, so let's go to those matching scores that I already mentioned. These matching scores in practice are usually some kind of measure of downstream engagement. Or something like the probability of connection, or some kind of combination of that. They're usually derived from a separate model. Like in a production system, this is an entirely separate model. This is just some score that is imported in my recommendation system. In research work on this, sometimes this is modeled, but oftentimes it's assumed to be some kind of deterministic function. And this is what we do here. We just assume it's a deterministic function of in fact, a logistic regression function of two main parameters. The first one is the network size. And here we assume that users with larger networks are more likely to form connections. And that is definitely an assumption that doesn't have to be true. Like, in practice, we would have to check that assumption. But the rationale here is just that users with larger networks may be having larger networks because they're proactive in connection forming, because they're generally also more active on the platform. And this is something that is definitely true. And then the second feature we're looking at is the number of common connections, where we assume that user pairs with more common connections are more likely to connect. This is a very well-known phenomenon used at known as triadic closure, and has been commonly observed in the social networks literature. And then the third feature we're looking at is similarity, where we assume that users that have similarities in something like demographic interests, education, workplace, etc., are more likely to connect than users who do not have a lot in common. And this just follows the general observation that individuals are more likely to be connected to similar individuals, right? This is a phenomenon referred to as homophily and is very well studied in kind of like the social science literature. Okay, so how does a simulation look like in more detail then? We simulate on a fixed size graph with evolving connections. So each node in the graph is a user. And we assume we have two groups with a 65%, 35% split. So there's a majority minority group, but it's not like the minority group is tiny, right? I think this is like a reasonable split. And then we sample covariate vectors from just a normal distribution. These are just the normal distribution covariate vector, right? But what we kind of implicitly want to say with that is, oh, users are different in like their workplace or their interests or whatever. Like these are all the features that we don't name explicitly. And we assume that these covariate vectors are kind of dependent on the group membership. And then we initialize connections with a stochastic block model where users are kind of more likely to be connected with people in the same group than with people in another group. And then we run the recommendation cycle already described for 2,500 time steps. The whole thing is also done several times and the results are all averaged, of course. But at each step of the simulation cycle, there's kind of a model plugged in, right? So users look for recommendations. We assume an exponential waiting time model that depends on current network size. Then for the matching scores, we query the matching scores that I just mentioned. And then the simulation is run separately for each type of fairness intervention we look at and for no fairness intervention at all. And then recommendations are served and we assume some kind of ground truth probability of people connecting, and then we move to the next step. And this assumed ground truth connection probability, because we don't know any better in the simulation, right? We just query from the matching scores model again, and the matching scores model has some kind of noise added to it, so it's not necessarily the same score, right? So, but by using the same model here, it's kind of like a best case analysis. Okay, so let's look at results. Let's first go through what all of the plots are showing here. So in the first one, so panel A, we see the absolute difference in average network sizes between groups. So on the x-axis in all of these plots, we see the time steps we're simulating over, and on the y-axis in this first one, we see the gap in average network sizes between the two groups. So if both groups have the same distribution of network sizes, or at least the same average, this should be 0. So this is what we would want internally. Then in B, we see the share of majority degrees. So if the distribution was kind of fair or kind of the same among groups, then this should be around the 65% mark, because that's the share of the majority group. And then in C, we see a rolling average, just to smooth it out a little bit, of the majority group share among destination members in new connections. So destination members, again, are the ones that are being sent a connection request, right? The ones that are being recommended. And then in D, we see the majority group share among all new degrees. So that includes the source member and the destination member. Okay, I will try to explain this more when I explain what to look at. But now let's look at what happens if we have no fairness intervention at all. So here we just have to look at plot A, really. We see that there's a gap in average network sizes, and it's heavily increasing in like a sublinear, in like a, almost like an exponential way, I would say. It's increasing here, right? So that's very concerning. So this is kind of, there's some interesting parts here. So first of all, there is an initial disparity already if you look at time step 0, right? That's just by the fact that the group is bigger and that we have a stochastic block model where people are more likely to be connected in group than out of group, and all of those reasons, right? So this initial disparity in average network sizes increases over time and benefits the already advantaged majority population. Actually, not displayed here, but network sizes do tend to a power law distribution with two different modes. And there's just a higher mode in the majority group. And then something we can also track is that the members whose network sizes are in the tail of the power law tend to be the members who already had large networks to begin with. So there's some kind of individual unfairness too that we don't really look into with more detail, but that's kind of interesting to note as well. And all of this is in line with previous findings, right? There's this effect of rich get richer. These kind of compounding effects of popularity bias is something that has been studied in social networks literature or recommendation literature before. Let's see what happens if we add our fairness constraints. So now we add demographic parity of exposure. So now we need to look at the green curves here. And we see that there is still an increasing gap in average network sizes, right? It's much less increasing than if we had no intervention, so it's helpful, but it's still increasing, which is interesting. We do see that the majority group share of exposure and recommendations came down a little bit. So this is panel C, but even there, we see that it's still above the 65% mark. And the reason for that is that majority group members, even if we enforce demographic parity of exposure intervention, majority group members are still more likely to connect after recommendation or being connected to after recommendation. And to understand this, let's look at this little example in the box at the top. So here we have like an artificial recommendation list. Let's assume that we have no position bias for now. So like all the positions count the same. And here I implicitly kind of assume the groups are like male and female, or people with long hair and people with short hair better. At the bottom, you have the matching scores. So if you just enforce demographic parity of exposure, we have like 3 of each group recommended here. So demographic parity of exposure is fulfilled, right? But what that doesn't take into account is the matching scores. And the matching scores in our model relates to the probability of connection, right? So the red numbers actually sum to lower number than the black numbers here, which means that even though people are recommended at the same rate, it's actually much less likely that a real connection is formed to the like female presented icons here. And this is why we still have this unfairness where in panel C, this line is not quite at 65%. Okay, so that didn't quite work out. Let's look at dynamic parity of utility intervention. First, in panel A, we see that again has gotten a little bit better than before, but it's still increasing, right? In C, we see that problem, at least on average over all time steps, is kind of fixed because now we actually do take into account the utility values here. But now we have a different problem. If you look at the box now in the example, we have 2 sets of recommendations, right? And again, remember, we enforce fairness metrics here in each recommendation list separately, right? So in the first row, we have a source member, like the member that is querying the recommendation, belongs to the male group, and the second, this member belongs to the female group. In both separately, like in both rows separately, all the black numbers and all the red numbers sum to the same. So we have the same number of expected connections formed based on this recommendation. But overall, the male member can expect to form more connections than the female member here. So now the bias is kind of introduced at the source side, right? And the problem here is that the fairness metric can actually not compare between different queries. And that's very fundamentally true because we only enforce fairness within a recommendation slate, and we have no way of measuring it between different recommendations. And this is why in panel C, if I look at the majority group share among all new degrees, this blue line here is still well above the 65% mark. And this is why this gap in A is increasing, or at least this is one reason why this gap in A is increasing. Okay, so this was an interesting experimental exploration of what's going on, simulation-based, but it's a little unclear, or it was a little unclear to us after we did this, whether this is the full story, what is really going on here, are these findings generalizable, or do they depend on like the simulation procedure we chose, and what can we do to actually reach a fair balance. So we wanted to look at a simple theoretical model. And here, the first thing I have to note is that the simulation procedure that we looked at before is obviously way too complicated to be able to characterize in theory what happens in the long term, right? So what we resorted to is a simple EARN model. And EARN models have been previously used in the fairness literature to show, like, to do limit analysis, and are kind of a good choice for that. So the kind of EARN model that we assume here is the dynamic growth EARN, often referred to as preferential attachment model. And in this case, if we have several different groups, it's often referred to as mixed preferential attachment model. So this is an evolving random graph model, and I'm going to describe the generative process. In each step, in each like loop of building this graph, a new node is added to the graph, and we kind of flip a coin for which group that node belongs to. And then subsequently, that new node is connected to exactly one already existing node in the graph, and only one. And how's that node selected? First of all, we select a node dependent on how many degrees that node already has, kind of normalized by all degrees in the graph. So it's more likely for a node to be selected here if that node already has a lot of connections. And then we sample whether that connection recommendation in some way is successful based on a mixing matrix, where rows and columns belong to the refer to the group membership. So if both the incoming node and the existing node that we sample belong to group 0, then the connection is successful with probability P0. And if both belong to group 1, then the connection is successful with P1, and so on. Then if the connection is successful, we add the node and connection to the graph and go back to step 1 and add a new node. And if not, then we go back to step 2 and sample a new node. And we kind of repeat this procedure until exactly one connection is formed. Okay, why is that in any way similar to the simulation we did, the empirical simulation that we did? It's not exactly the same, obviously, but I want to argue that some of the more qualitative features of our simulation and of this mixed preferential attachment model actually are based on the same ideas and kind of show the same ties to each other. So we flip a coin for the group membership, which means that majority group members, there will be more majority group members joining the graph, right? And joining the graph is the same as querying a recommendation. In our simulation that we did before, we did kind of enforce that majority group members seek out more recommendations by the exponential waiting time model, because that exponential waiting time model depends on the network size, and majority group members have a larger network size. Then also selecting the node to connect to, or selecting the node to be recommended based on how many degrees it already has, also means that recommendation is more likely the larger the network already is, which loosely ties to the number of common connections feature we're using. Like if somebody has a larger graph, it's more likely that you already have a higher number of common connections. And then the mixing matrix kind of enforces some kind of homophily statement if we assume that P0 and P1 are larger than 0.5 here, in which case a member would be more likely to connect to a member of the same group than they would be to a member of an opposite group. Okay, so let's go to the limit analysis. So there has been this recent paper by Avin et al. In 2020, and they study mixed preferential attachment in this way that I just described. And they observed that there is a rich get richer phenomenon in groups. So the statistic that we're looking at is alpha T here, and alpha T is the rate of minority group degrees at time T. And then we look what happens with this as I let T go to infinity. So if the average number of network sizes were the same across both groups, then this alpha would be R, right? Because R was the coin flip probability that we had initially. So R is the share of the minority group. Okay, but what they show is that if I look at this alpha and I don't intervene in any kind of fairness way, then there is, first of all, there is a limit, like I do get to a stable point, and that limit kind of implies that the distribution of network sizes tends to a power law distribution with different exponents for the different groups. And I didn't write what the limit is like explicitly here, but if you look at it, we can see that in the homophily setting, networks of the majority group still outgrow networks of the minority group. And in general, this alpha is not R, and this asymptotic equilibrium is unfair in most of the interesting settings we're looking at. This effect in general, like if you don't look, well, this effect in general is, I think, known as rich get richer, Matthew effect, popularity bias, those kinds of words, right? And has been well studied. But the thing that's kind of new here is that it's like dependent on, if you look at two different groups that behave differently, then you get two power law distributions. Okay, this is where this paper ended, and kind of our exploration starts. Is the adding the fairness constraints. So now we need to like somehow translate the fairness constraints we had earlier, and we start with demographic parity in recommendations. Demographic parity, if you like squint at it for a little bit, kind of implies that for this model would kind of imply that the likelihood that I select a member for recommendation for each group needs to be proportional to the group size, right? So this is exactly what we're enforcing here by changing step 2. So instead of sampling a tentative neighbor directly, we first flip a coin for the group that that member is supposed to belong to. And then we sample a tentative neighbor from that group based on how many degrees they have. So this is how we enforce that both groups have like the exposure relating to their group size. Okay, what happens in this setting? In our paper, we show that if we assume a mixed preferential attachment model with this type of demographic parity step that I just described, then the share of degrees of the minority population still tends to a fixed value that is independent of the initial graph. And here I gave a closed form solution for what that looks like. So it depends on R, which is the share of the minority group. It depends on P1 and P0, which are the probabilities of connection from the mixing matrix, right? What does that expression actually mean? In the homophily setting, when we assume that P0 and P1 are both greater than 0.5 and P1 is not smaller than P0, they could be the same, then we generally have that this alpha is smaller than R, which means that the minority group in like this asymptotic state is still disadvantaged, still has smaller networks than the majority group. And this is because this intervention can kind of only interrupt the group-wide feedback loop from faster growing networks on the destination side, but any other source of bias is untouched by this. Yeah, this is exactly what we observed earlier, right? We only enforce exposure parity. Okay, so what would we have to do in order to get stable equality of error network sizes? In order to get there, I looked at this particular rejection sampling idea. So what are we doing here? We go back to the original mixed preferential attachment model, and we kind of add some steps here. So after we sample a tentative neighbor, we do a rejection sampling of that tentative neighbor. And we retain this neighbor with probability Q ij, where I refers to the group of the source member and J to the group of the destination member. So it's almost like we have a second mixing matrix, right? Just we use it for rejection sampling. And then if rejected, we sample a new tentative neighbor. So now in order to form a connection, we have to both survive the rejection sampling step and the mixing matrix step. And if we do that, then we can show theoretically that we can actually get to this kind of equilibrium that we want. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. So here we need to set the cues. The question basically is, how do we need to set the cues of the rejection sampling matrix, right? And the answer is those have to be dynamic. They need to depend on the state of the system right now in every time step. So they're different in every time step. And we show that if we set them as depicted here, again, they depend on alpha t, which is the current share of the minority group, and then on r and p1 and p0, which are all fixed in time. Then we actually get to a state where the limit of the expected share of minority group degrees alpha t tends to r, which is exactly the share of the minority group. So this would be a fair setting if the statistics for fairness we're looking at is average network sizes. What are the basic observations here? In order to get there, the cues have to be dynamic. They need to depend on the current state of the system. So they need to be updated in every iteration. If we look at this more carefully, this actually corresponds directly to the dynamic parity of utility intervention we had in our simulation. We're updating those cues. It's kind of like updating the matching scores U, the probability of connection. And we show that this kind of version of dynamic parity of utility here prevents all bias introduced at the destination side of the recommendation, right? In our theoretical setting here, this leads to a fair model. But in our empirical exploration before, this didn't work out. And this didn't work out because we had bias introduced at the source side of the recommendation as well. So key findings of this paper, first of all, unconstrained connection recommendation leads to a group race rich get richer effect. So we really should intervene here in some way. But typical ways of intervening is something like enforcing demographic parity of exposure or dynamic parity of utility. And this we show actually leads to less bias amplification, but cannot stop amplification of biases entirely. And I want to stress here that I'm talking about amplification of biases, right? It's not even that it cannot decrease bias, it can't even stop amplification of bias. So that's a problem. And then our theoretical analysis suggests that dynamic parity of utility type interventions would be optimal if there is no source side bias. But that's kind of unrealistic in practice, right? And the reason why it doesn't work is that it doesn't compare between different recommendation slates, between different source users. Which seems to be key to enforce, to get to kind of this equilibrium in the long term. And so the basic future work, I guess, basic takeaway is that
I just have a question, but if you're wrapping up, I will let you go and then I'll ask it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, I'm wrapping up. Okay, so basic conclusion here is that if we're interested in something like equity and network sizes, we need to target both bias at source side and destination side of the recommendation. I think, yeah, this was the last slide. Thank you, everyone. And maybe we can move to questions now.